All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the WatchWell Podcast. My name is Parker, and as you can see, this is not Nick. No, Nick is not on this one. This, however, is my friend Jason Cork. Jason and I, we've been friends for
about 8 years. Right?
Yeah, 8 years. You're the pastor at Olmsted Church, and you just helped me learn how to spell it. It's not Homestead, it's Olmsted.
North Olmsted.
North Olmsted Church.
Evangelical Friends Church.
That's a mouthful, man.
Yeah. NOEFC for short.
Yeah, right. And, your wife, Melissa, we love her and your son and daughter.
Daughter
Sadie, son Matthew.
She's turning 17.
That's right.
Matthew is turning 12. So.
That's right. Man, it's crazy. You, when you walked in, when you first got here, you made the observation that Matthew was 4.
Yeah, he was your son's age when we...
Yeah, crazy. Nuts, man. Okay, so you're a worship pastor. Mm-hmm. What is your favorite worship song?
Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Okay.
Or blessed be your name.
Yeah.
That's the title.
Blessed be your name.
Yeah.
That one? Yeah.
Matt Redman, 1997.
Yep. I like 10,000 Hours. I like
Reasons.
Yeah. There are 10,000 Reasons. Yeah. 10,000. Yeah. 10,000 Hours is actually a Justin Bieber song. Not to be confused.
Would hate to confuse the two.
Yeah. Okay. So Jason, do you want to do the honors and introduce the movie?
Sure. We're going to be talking about Mr. Hollands Opus, which is a 1995 film.
It is a 1995 film. I'll go through all of the introduction-y stuff that Nick usually does here. If you just want to give us, this is just the copy and paste synopsis. I'm referring to my notes here. If you just want to give me your own little clip of the movie, like intro trailer kind of thing.
Yeah. So I picked this movie because it's about a music teacher. So
Mm-hmm.
I went to school for music education and vocal performance. This movie came out when I was 20, when I was a junior in college. So I was right in the middle of student teaching and kind of looking forward to becoming a music teacher. So it was very inspiring at the time. So it's about a frustrated composer
Mm-hmm.
who basically has to go to his fallback option because his music career didn't work out.
Right.
And he becomes a music teacher, and it tells his story over 30 years.
Yeah.
So you get to see, I like to say it's kind of like a Forrest Gump
Yeah.
kind of approach, which came out the year before. So it's,
Right.
You get to see him at various stages of his life. And what's kind of cool is because I've watched the movie over several years, I've been several of those stages.
Okay.
And so even this rewatch,
Right.
it was kind of cool to watch because it's just a different perspective on different things he faced.
And I imagine it kind of hits you in your own little personal spot because of the music
Mm-hmm.
background that you have and all of that. Have you ever wanted to compose anything like that, or to that degree? Or
when I was going to school, I had 2 goals. I was either going to be Steve Green or a music teacher.
okay.
And so when I graduated college, I actually went on tour for a few months.
Oh, wow.
I did 3 months of traveling in my car and
Good.
kind of traveling different churches, and I wrote songs and did a couple of recordings.
Okay.
And then I said, okay, well, let me try the other avenue.
Right.
So I've always kind of been bivocational in regards.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've done songwriting.
So then how did that lead? So how did that lead to worship pastor?
So for the first 10 years after college, I had the traveling music ministry,
Mm-hmm.
but it was in the denomination that I was raised in.
Okay.
And when we left that church, I kind of did a reset.
Okay.
And lost and kind of closed the doors of the traveling music ministry and then switched to being a worship pastor. So that's what I've done on and off for the last 15 years.
That's cool. Okay. So real quick, we're just going to run through this. I'm doing this in honor of Nick because he loves budgets and he loves the grossing box office stuff, critics. And so this is a PG movie. I actually think that that's a pretty fair rating. I don't know that anybody that is like super young would, understand a lot of what's going on. It'd be rather boring. PG is a good rating. Released in 1995, which is what you mentioned, December 29th of 1995. The budget for the movie was $23 million estimated. And the gross in US and Canada was over 82 million. But it only did 14,000 opening weekend is what I got from IMDb.
Which is interesting because
it's one of those movies that grow on you. Like it didn't do great, and then over time
kind of came under the radar. But I mean, Richard Dreyfuss was nominated for an Academy Award,
right? So that's super interesting. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see worldwide opening weekend, because I have it's grossing 106 million worldwide. And then, as usual, we have Rotten Tomatoes score 75% on the tomato meter, and 84% audience score with a 7.3 out of 10 on IMDb. So as far as the ratings, do you agree or disagree?
Well, I mean, I think some of the criticisms of the movie is that it gets maybe a little bit cheesy or kind of melodramatic. There might be some of those elements. It's not. I don't think it's going to appeal to if you're looking for action.
Right.
It really is a personal story. And I think if you identify with music or teaching or performing arts in any way, then I think it's going to appeal to you.
Yeah.
Or being a teacher, it's kind of one of those.
And I would just preface that leadership is also being a teacher. So this is really applies to everyone. If you're in a leadership position, which is everyone, parents, if you have employees at work, there's various degrees of leadership. So I think it applies to everybody.
Yeah, and I think the uniqueness of it is, and I heard this on a listening to something recently. Most teacher stories happen in like the course of a couple months or a year,
right?
But the fact that it tells over 30 years, I think, is really kind of a unique thing. Well,
that's actually a good point that you bring that up, because it's very much reminiscent. So there's two movies that came to mind, and I forget the name of the first one. But the second one is the Ron Clark story. You've seen that movie?
Okay. Yeah.
With Chandler and Friends.
Oh, okay. David Schwimmer?
No.
That's
oh my gosh. Yeah. No. That's Joey. It's the
one that just
Matthew Perry.
Matthew Perry. Okay.
I was like, man, Kayla's gonna have my head for that one because she's a big Matthew Perry fan. But yeah, it was very reminiscent to that movie.
Okay.
But to your point, that movie was over the course of one calendar, like school year.
Right.
And it was about him coming in and helping this classroom. It wasn't like music in nature. It was just a classroom teacher movie. But I started off thinking that was where this was going, but then it kind of turned more into A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe, where it was over the course of his life.
Right.
And in that movie was a little bit different because he suffered from some pretty severe hallucinations and stuff like that. I don't know if you remember the movie.
Yes.
But yeah, so this was very, like, I've never seen this movie before today. So I was like, where's it going? So I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun watching it. I took a ton of notes.
Seeing the character at different stages in his life.
Yeah.
Interact with situations, the growth that happens. So you jump in 15 years later. He's different.
He's
grown. He's reacting to things differently, and the acting in Richard Dreyfuss.
Yeah, I would say that would be my only critique of the movie. Would be I wish they would have made the changes in time, or like showing time elapsing, a little bit more obvious. There was a couple of times where I was like, oh, okay. So he's like, it's
at the first part is a little tricky because it's like the first couple days of school, and then it's like the middle of the year. So the first part of the movie is actually the longest part.
It is.
Where the ending chapter is pretty quick.
Right. Yeah. I was like halfway through, and I was like, oh man, I'm only halfway through.
And it's a pretty long movie. I mean,
it's
like
2 hours and
43 minutes. That's a long movie. So.
But like at the very end, when you saw the mayor come in.
The governor.
The governor. The governor come in. And I didn't realize who she was until she had her clarinet.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So yeah, I remember that, but it was, I wish they would have followed that a little bit better from someone like just coming in and watching it and not having seen it a whole bunch of times. You see it 2 or 3 times. It's really easy to catch, but so there's that. Cool. So let's just dig into the movie.
Yeah.
I want to start with some of your takeaways since you picked the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I shared, it kind of tugs at the heartstrings, because when I saw it originally, when I was 20 years old, I was in that most optimistic, I'm going to change lives, and this is what I want to do, so I'm bawling. Every time I watch this movie, I cry. But then a little bit later in life, so at first you see it from the perspective of, look at the difference he made, right? But then when I got a little bit later in my life, I was like, but he gave up what he really wanted to do,
right?
And so that's kind of where I saw it. But now I see it as running the race well, right? So like that midpoint that you see him at, that 15-year mark, when he has his greatest temptation,
Yeah.
to basically walk away from everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the age that I'm at now, or was that a few years ago?
Right.
So I kind of have lived through that midlife crisis that all men go through, of that psychological, hey, do I keep going? It would be much easier. And many people do, right? Many people do buy the big car and leave all their responsibilities. So I thought that was very accurately portrayed. And then I got, kind of looking forward to that last stage of finishing well and leaving that legacy. That's kind of the stage I'm at in ministry right now. And as a Christ follower and someone that wants to finish well, we've seen so many examples of people not finishing well.
Right.
And their whole life's work is just, it just goes away because they did something stupid, and so that's what really was relatable.
Yeah, or they didn't root it in something that will last.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
so many biographies of musicians. It's like, what did they do? I mean, I recently watched the one with Whitney Houston, and it's like she spent a lot of money and she had this incredible voice, and what's her legacy? Some great performances. Well, I certainly want my legacy in my life to mean more than just that,
Right. And I think that's the biggest learning thing that he the biggest takeaway.
Right.
Sorry, I'm trying to flip here because I forgot that I wanted to read this before we started. Now I remember. But it was kind of on my mind as I was watching the movie here. So Romans 5, 1 through 11 says, therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have peace in God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. For while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his son. Much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. More than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. So I just kind of wanted that in the back of our minds as we kind of talked about this movie, because there was a lot of suffering and a lot of endurance.
Oh my gosh, he hated it at first, right? Like that's what he says to his wife. He says, "I hate teaching, Iris. I hate it," and she says, "You can still quit." Right.
And in my notes, so like I wrote the way I do my notes is I write little like chapter titles, like I'm reading a book, right?
Yeah.
And I wrote undesired place, and then I'm gonna pull this up real quick. James 1:12 came to mind. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. So, in spite of our trials and tribulations, the true test of faith is to remain faithful.
He didn't give up.
And he didn't give up.
And honestly, the case can be made that he was really a jerk for most of the movie.
He was.
He was selfish, right? Like he didn't understand the struggles with his family. He poured himself into his career more than his work. So he was very flawed. Yeah. But by the end, you see a different person.
So I took away a big change. So and real quick before we get ahead of ourselves, because this was a fun movie. The main characters here are Glenn Holland and his wife Iris Holland. Bill Meister is the football coach. Principal Jacobs, and then Vice Principal Walters was William H. Macy's character.
One of his first roles.
He did great. He plays that like pharisaical assistant principal so
He's
well.
Got a religious spirit on him.
Yeah, he does. It was so good.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that undesired place, he finds himself. And I think a lot of people, this is why it's such a good movie, is because it follows life challenges and ebbs and flows so very well, which is why it's so relatable. But that undesired place, I'm meant for more, right? That feeling, even more so for us men, it's like, am I able to overcome and make it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's
And when I was younger, that burden of, I was always taught you were given many talents.
Mhm.
You have a responsibility
right.
to use them, and to much is given, much is required. So I had that mentality for a long time, of I have to do enough.
Right.
And I don't have that burden anymore. But boy, I did when I was younger.
Right.
And so, yeah, he wants his life to matter. He wants to be able to use his gifts.
But the way he imagines using his gifts is different than a bigger plan,
Than what he's called to.
than what
you
he
could say.
thinks he is called to, right?
Right.
Because what I took from the movie, and I guess one of the main points would be that he looked at music as his calling.
Right.
But reality sits in when music was just a tool to fulfill the bigger calling.
And that's what I've always said. As
Right.
a worship pastor, a tool, God allows me to use music as a tool to help encourage people in their walk with him.
Right.
And to become the people that God has always intended them to be. And I think that's exactly what he does in
Right.
the movie.
Right. That's so good.
So
Any other things? We can keep rolling if you want.
yeah, I mean, I love the themes of, like we talked about just calling, and we
Right.
can talk about that. I saw a little bit of an analogy of, we could talk about the worship wars,
Mhm.
contemporary versus traditional, and
Yep,
kind of
for sure.
that scene with Vice Principal, who you're teaching them rock and roll.
Yeah. It's
know,
of the devil.
but that's the moment that he starts to really connect with the students,
Right.
So I love that concept. And then just, that whole temptation, fleeing sin, like that's a huge
It's
chapter.
huge.
And I think the whole chapter is not just about one specific sin. I think it's, an analogy for just rejecting,
Mm-hmm.
where you're placed to be, your responsibilities. It can be any number of sins.
Yeah. What scene in the movie are you speaking?
That's the Rowena chapter, where he basically has the moment when he wishes he went off to New York to be
with the girl? Yeah.
And so he's really tempted,
Right.
to either run off to New York with her, and you don't know in that scene if he's going to go or not. And some people think that's a really controversial scene. But the struggle was real, because he was having a lot of struggle at home at that point.
Right.
And he was frustrated and tired and worn out. And that's when we're very vulnerable.
And so I have this here. So just for the audience, if you're listening to this, I've never actually read this book, but I found a video as like a short synopsis. And the book is it's by, I think his name's Richard Green, but it's, the laws of seduction. And I thought it interesting as I was watching this movie, because this specific video on this book talks about different archetypes of seductive, like, archetypes. And this fits so well. So this archetype feeds off of someone who is experiencing daily life as harsh. And this person is constantly seeking escape from it in fantasies and dreams. And this archetype's called the star, and the star feeds on this type of person. Okay. And that's exactly what was presented to Mr. Holland, was this attractive younger lady, big dreams, big goals, amazing voice, success is in her future. Yeah. And he is dealing with everything at home that is, the responsibilities of having a deaf child, and not like, that was the most gut-wrenching part for me, was his life is music and his son can't hear it. And and one could make the argument, I would make the argument that the entire first hour and a half of the movie, if there's that much time, or whatever time is before that, is that Romans 5, where suffering produces endurance, perseverance, so that he could make the right decision at the end of the movie and flee that temptation.
So he needed to go.
So he needed to go through those
to
things
get him strong enough to be able to face.
Right.
So yeah, if that situation, if you're putting into a context in a faith perspective,
right,
God had a plan.
He did,
for him having a deaf child.
Right.
And he knew it was going to be that would shape his character.
Right. And even more so, that music is not the end goal.
Right.
Of, like, music is not the Messiah. Music is not what you put your faith in.
Right.
And in this movie, it's music, but Like for me, it was baseball.
Mhm.
You know, for many people in, you know, our American culture is sports.
Right.
It's, you know, these things that become our identities. And
Well, and think about the end of the movie when that's taken away from him.
right.
You know, and I think all the time, you know, my role as a worship pastor, I have to be a steward of it while I can.
Right.
But there's going to be a day when I don't lead worship anymore.
Right.
What I do can't be my identity.
Right.
And so that's where he really struggled. And you never saw that resolved.
No.
At the end of the movie, he kind of rides off into the sunset, but where does he go from here? We don't know.
And the rewards, I kind of thought about that too at the end of that Romans verse where I think it was at the end of the Romans verse. This is kind of off the cuff here, but like now that I'm thinking about it, his dream was to write that American symphony, right? And do all that. But look at what, like in terms of like, if we take the movie and we put it in more of like a Christian perspective, what more was he blessed with?
Yeah.
He still got his symphony. It wasn't on his time. It wasn't in and of himself doing it for his glory, but he got his symphony as the cherry on top of the symphony of people that he touched with his ability to teach and guide. And
that's what's, I mean, the uniqueness of the book ending of the movie.
Right.
Because the first opening, you never see a full 3 minutes of instrumental music at the beginning of a movie.
I do have to admit, I kind of fast forwarded.
Okay, but that's what it starts with.
It does.
He's conducting in his mind that piece that he then conducts at the end. So I think about it as sometimes our dreams have to die so that we can fall in love with
pick up our own cross. Yeah, right.
And that's kind of what happened to me, you know, having my traveling music ministry where I'd travel to different churches, you know, kind of be a singing evangelist. And I'd pop in here and pop in there. And while I enjoyed singing and while I enjoyed sharing stories and encouraging people, you can't compare that type of ministry to being in the same church every week.
Right. With the same community.
Same people digging deeper.
Right.
Which is really what God has, you know,
was what we're called
me to do.
Right. Yeah.
Not just that in and out splash.
Right.
But how can I, you know, not to disparage people that do traveling ministries, but
right.
for me, it just became much more purposeful.
Cool. Did you write anything about the compass?
You know, I didn't, but that's an important piece. And I love how, because Miss Olympia Dukakis, who plays Mrs. Jacobs, you know, she really is the key mentor for him. She doesn't get a lot of screen time, but she's the one that hires him, right, and challenges him, which we all need people to challenge us. But what was the first comment she made about the compass at the beginning of the movie?
At the beginning of the movie, she said something about teaching is more than just filling like heads or students' heads with knowledge. It's also about like something to do with guiding them or pointing them in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah, and he didn't get that at first.
And he was
showing up, doing what he was.
We're going to talk about Bach today, you know.
But he wasn't invested in the students.
No.
He wanted to get out of there as soon as he could.
Punch in, punch out.
Yeah. He said he leaves the parking lot quicker than...
Yeah.
And I remember those days, you know, there were certainly teachers that did that. And, but yeah, then at the end, or not the end, but at the end of her chapter, she gave him a compass as a present.
Yeah. So. And so the compass, like obviously everybody watching these movies know that everybody has presuppositions. And when we review these movies through the lens of truth and we do what we do here to practice viewing life through a biblical lens, you're always going to have your presuppositions. Any worldview has presuppositions. So when I say this next thing, understand that we totally acknowledge that we have presuppositions, but the compass to me was very interesting because a lot of education is about finding truth, and essentially if you have a teacher that is not grounded in faith, in scripture, that was my question. How can they guide?
Wow. Or where are they guiding them to? They're guiding them somewhere.
They're guiding them somewhere, but
you can't
doesn't matter. It's all you
can't escape your biases. So,
right.
So you are indoctrinating people when you're teaching. You're indoctrinating people into your worldview.
Right.
Yeah.
That was powerful to me because it was like if you're a teacher and you don't, if you don't have. Everybody needs Christ and scripture to justify the way they live their life. Because even those who don't believe in God and reject the Christian faith live like Christians because it's written on their heart. You know what I mean? So they'll still appeal to justice,
right?
And they'll still appeal to love and things of life that all of us partake in.
Yeah.
You know, they'll say that lying is wrong, murder is wrong, but they'll reject the justification for it.
How do we know it's wrong?
How do we know, right? Yeah. So
Well,
I thought that was so powerful when she talked about the compass and guiding, and I thought, man, that's so powerful for teachers because they are doing that. The question is, how do they know what they're guiding their students to is true and has a basis of justification for how they should live their life and form their worldview?
Well, and not only that, but the responsibility of a teacher. Like
right.
when I was, and that's what the scripture says, right? Like teachers and pastors are held to a higher standard.
Right.
And so when I was a teacher, and I taught for 6 years, so I taught middle school my first year in Boca Raton, Florida, and then I taught for 5 years, 2 years full-time, 3 years part-time at a high school. So I taught choir and, so I did this. And actually last summer we were down in Florida and I had my Mr. Hollands moment.
Okay.
I actually got together with some of my former students.
Nice.
20 years later.
That's awesome.
And what was cool about it was not like, I mean, sure, I caught up and found out what they were doing, but hearing how my teaching impacted them and what they took from it, that was powerful.
Right.
You know, because it was seeds that were planted
years and years ago.
Yeah. And it wasn't even just like musical concepts I taught them.
Right.
It was, everything else about. Right. So I look back at the time and I go, I can't believe, God, how you used me in that time.
Right.
Even when I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but somehow, and I think that's the encouragement for all of us, that if you're just obedient to serve where you're called to serve, the Holy Spirit will fill in the gaps.
Right.
So yeah, but
every Christian is going to suffer from imposter syndrome because we all are.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, he didn't know how to teach.
Right.
The whole first part of the movie.
Yeah.
He's conducting. He's like, oh, that's good.
Yeah, he's just the data center, just transferring data. There's no, I actually care that it sticks on the other side. He's just giving them information
because he was focused on the material instead of the student.
Right.
When he made that switch, which is that scene with the clarinet.
Right.
And he starts telling her to play the sunset. Right.
Yep.
Like then he started to appeal to the person,
right,
and he connected to the person just like Jesus did, right?
Right.
I mean, you could hear truth all day long, but when he made that personal connection,
right,
and the person said, wow, he's talking to me,
he
knows me. The sheep, the sheep follow the shepherd because he knows them, and what's it called? He hears their voice.
Yeah, I know where you're at.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
And that makes the lesson so much more effective.
Yeah. For sure. And then let's see, I'm trying to follow my notes here. So then something big happens and he has a new purpose. And this new purpose was like an oh crap moment, wife, he comes in, he's got all this other stuff on his mind and wife drops it on him. All of us guys that have been there. I'm pregnant.
Yeah. Cause he thought he was only going to teach for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And they don't really go into any explanation as to why that was only a couple of years or what their end goal was, but everything changes.
Well, wasn't it because he was going to teach and then she was going to do the photography thing?
Right.
And then they were going to make enough money and then he was going to be able to quit after she got her photography.
Back to being performed.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it was something like that.
Yeah.
And then, but he has this baby. And then that's when you really started to see the shift between I'm just here to check a box and tell them what I know, as opposed to I'm here to get them to know what I know and help them grow as well. Mm-hmm. That was the big difference because he's like, I like, this is big. Like, it's not about me anymore. So you saw this shift of going from this prideful, I hate where I am, throwing tantrums like a child to, well, it's not about me anymore. This has to work.
We have to buy a house. So I have to take care. So he does make a huge shift in, taking care of his family,
right,
putting their needs before his own. And even though he was still wrestling with being resentful, I think that instinct that we all have, right?
Right.
To take care of our families, to be the hunter-gatherer, to to sacrifice for our family. Yeah, and that's probably the first moral shift that we see in his life.
Right.
And I mean, being the dad of two kids, I mean, I can tell you that, I mean, I think the most effective way that God teaches us character is by giving us kids.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of suffering in that. No, I'm just kidding. Kind of. I'm going to read this because I think it's really good. We're talking about fathers and we're talking about parents. So another big thing, this happens a little bit later in the movie, but the quote of sorry, I got to gather my thoughts here. So they find out that their son is deaf.
Mm-hmm.
He's only got 10% of his hearing, or 10% of his hearing. And they go to the school that teaches American Sign Language.
Right.
And the headmaster or principal or of that school made a comment. And the quote was something like, you as the parents are the most important teachers he will ever have. And then right after that, you see Mr. Hollands still struggling with the fact that he has a deaf son, and he's still throwing some of these tantrums, and he's trying. You see the imbalance in his life, and so I want to read this. So this is actually a book. It's called The Warrior Poet Way. Came out a few months ago, and I was watching this in real time, and at the same time I was recalling this. So this is a little bit. It's not a lot. So just bear with me here. But it says, the unbalanced man. Imagine a man who works very hard at his job and comes home exhausted. His wife, who also works hard, has a running list of daily honeydew items that needs his attention. He keeps putting these things off until he can find a little more time and energy. The grass needs to be cut. The power bill is overdue. The dog needs to go to the vet, and a tire on one of the cars is leaking. When this man comes through the door from a long day of work, he wants nothing more than to fall into his favorite chair for some much-needed peace and quiet. But there's a pile of his laundry there that needs to be folded and put away. In the other room, he hears the kids fighting. And in the next moment, one is crying hysterically. His wife calls from another room, reminding him that they are going to dinner tonight with the neighbors. Rest will have to remain out of reach for a while longer. How long? Who knows? This is life for most men. The average man moves from one scene of life to the next, constantly burdened by what must be done. He is aware of the obligations that need to be filled, the tasks that haven't been completed, the people who require his attention. Almost every day brings with it a new set of issues that threaten to overwhelm him. This man always has something to do, someone to please, some problem to occupy his mind. There's always more work than time available, more needs from his family than he can afford, and more causes that require his energy. For a while, a man can handle these demands if he's strong and disciplined, but eventually the pressure becomes unbearable. After enough time, the man will either snap or he will simply shut down, allowing burnout to run its course. He will become a shell of a man, a ghost in his own life, moving from one moment to the next like a robot. If he's lucky, he will muster just enough energy to get above the line, then dive immediately back into responsibilities, resetting the vicious cycle. You can imagine similarly a wife who's juggling a career and trying to be the glue that holds the family together. She shoulders the lion's share of childcare, does her best to keep a tidy home and put food on the table. Even harder, imagine a single mother doing the same. Life's difficult with all the things that require a person's heart, strength, and mind, but it's even harder when you have to do it on your own. Neither of these scenarios for the man or woman can be sustained for long. We need balance, and we all struggle to create it. And I was hearing that in my head as I was watching the scene where the kid can't communicate. Connor can't communicate. Cole can't communicate, and Mr. Holland's trying to write and play the piano. Mom's trying to feed him and like trying to figure it all out, and everything just boils and explodes.
Yeah.
And then the mom is just, I just want to communicate to my kid. I just want to talk to my kid. And then you really saw it on, I think Richard Dreyfuss did an amazing job in that scene where it hit, like reality hit him. And I took that as like, I am being selfish. And this is like what torment am I putting my wife and my child through that? And I think it was even later in the movie till he fully understood it about prioritizing wife, job, kids, fatherhood, those things.
Well, and did you catch that the first advice they got about their son was not good advice?
It was awful advice, and it was from the doctor.
Because it was early on.
It was early on.
They didn't understand
Right.
how to deal with deaf kids back then. And so
Right.
I thought it was a really good way that they did that. But for some reason, he believed the first person.
Yeah.
Because it was almost a dismissive, like, we just have to deal with this.
Yeah. Well, it's also the sense of authority. And I think that our Western culture believes
So he
the
believed
degree.
the male doctor versus the female.
I was saying, I don't know if it was a male or female thing in my mind. I think it was just, that's what the doctor said.
Okay.
And so that's what we're going
Where
with.
the teacher, maybe this program is a little bit more experimental.
Right,
Or new.
right.
Where they really were lifting the kids up, helping them
Right.
reach their potential versus pushing them down.
Right.
Which,
Because when a medical professional says something, usually people listen because they've been to medical school.
right.
And what has the last 4 years taught us about that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, not to get super political or into the weeds on that. I'm just saying that just because you have, a couple of letters next to your name, whether it be pastor, father, doctor,
Mhm.
People can be wrong.
Well, and how about this? I've been married 20 years, and Melissa and I have a written rule that if one doesn't feel right about something,
You default.
you
Yep.
need to speak up.
Right.
And you stop.
Right.
And we can look back on our 20 years, and when one of us does not speak up is where we go off the rails.
Right.
And when we look back at it and they go, oh, you know what? I had this sinking feeling. So in that moment, he really had to trust his wife. And you're right. I mean, there are moments we're kind of thick-headed sometimes,
Yeah.
right? We just don't get it. And then all of a sudden something clicks.
Right.
And we're like, oh, we get it now.
Yeah.
And so finally he got it. But it took him a long time to buy in.
Yeah, I think he kind of saw it, but then again, he just kind of shoved it down.
Yeah, he didn't learn the sign
Then,
language like his wife.
he didn't, and it was still about him just trying to survive, because he was so depressed that he wasn't living out the life that he envisioned for himself.
And that's why that moment when he sings the song. So now he got that balance of teaching and family, and all of a sudden it worked together.
It did.
That was powerful.
It was that was a very good scene, because at the very end he sang like,
beautiful boy,
beautiful Cole. Yeah, he said his son's name. So good.
He did the lights and the.
I loved that it was kind of bad. Like, it made it seem more genuine, because he wasn't a singer.
Right.
Like, the movie did not set him up to be a singer, but it was dad doing something. It wasn't a great performance. The music was good,
right,
but his singing was not good. And it to me, in terms of the movie screenplay and things like that, scripting, to me it showed a sense of vulnerability, because he wasn't that great at singing. And anyone knows, like, you go to any person and you say, hey, sing. The first, no, I don't want to do that. Why? It's because you're putting yourself out there and you're vulnerable, and he wasn't that great at it, and he still did it for his son. And it was like this, it was almost intimate is the way it kind of looked on screen to me.
So the scripture that comes to mind, when we are weak, he is made strong.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not impressive when we can operate in our strengths.
Right.
And do something. Like, God can't get the credit in that moment. Thinking about David and Goliath, David shouldn't have been able to defeat this giant.
Right.
But through the grace of God and through the training that he was brought up in. So that's kind of neat. And that's kind of a challenge of, sometimes God calls us to operate in our weakness.
Right.
Where like singing, performing is easy for me.
Right.
Having empathy for people and stepping in and walking.
Right.
Through the difficult stuff and feeling, that's really hard for me sometimes.
Yeah. Along with a lot of other guys too.
But that's where God calls me to serve.
Right.
Right. And he's challenging me.
And it's actually really interesting that you say that, because usually worship is more of an emotional realm.
Well, yeah.
It's intimate, it's emotional. You would think empathy would follow that.
Yeah. Another way of putting it would be, God, why didn't you give me all the skills I needed to do what you've called me to do? But calling comes before equipping. And so while you're serving obediently in that calling, what I found is that he is developing
Right.
that in you as you're serving. And so yeah, for me, it's much easier to share my heart with corporately
Right.
than it is individually.
That makes sense. Um, cool. We're actually wrapping up here. Is anything else? I think we talked about a lot of that.
Yeah, well, I think the one story that I really enjoyed was kind of that first moment when he decides to connect with the students, right? So the scene where it's early on in the movie where he realizes he's not getting anywhere because the kids really don't care about Bach and all those things. But then he plays Lover's Concerto, which is a pop song based on Minuet in G. And then all of a sudden he's got their attention.
Right.
And then he starts playing this rock music, and then Vice Principal Walters like freaks out and he runs down the hallway to find out what's happening. And he's actually called into the principal's office, and you know, the principal Jacob says, well, what am I supposed to say to the school board because you're teaching rock and roll?
Right.
And he says, well, I'm going to do whatever it takes to connect to these students, basically.
Right.
And I think that's a real key moment. And I think it really models what we've seen in our lifetime. You know, the whole low church movement. I mean, we can see it in the history of the church, where God has kind of realigned. Church gets too lofty and high and away from the people. Low church, making the gospel clear and communicated in a way that people understand. So that started, you know, with Luther translating the Bible into German. We see it today in singing songs in keys that people are able to sing. We use technology. So the methods change, but the message doesn't change. So he was still communicating the same message to the students and trying to get them excited about learning and about music. He just did it in a way that they understood. And I think that's really key. I mean, you see it all over Jesus's ministry, right? I mean, so the Pharisees got so caught up in all the rules and regulations that they lost the message along the way. He was healing on the Sabbath. They say, what are you doing healing people? He said, well, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. This is why I came. And so I think we see it really powerfully in Jesus's ministry. And that was the real transformative piece. But I really related to that.
Right.
Because again, as the worship wars, you know, what we see now is the people that were fighting for the contemporary music are now fighting for the music from 25 years ago.
Right.
Which so many people that I work with, I mean, my favorite worship song we mentioned, Blessed Be Your Name, that's 27 years old. Yeah. Or my pastor and I were getting ready for this weekend. He said, well, how about the contemporary version of the Wondrous Cross, the Wonderful Cross? I said, Pastor, that's 24 years old. So this word contemporary that we use is just so funny because 24-year-old music is not relatable to anybody that is in, college or below.
Right.
So it doesn't matter. What matters is the message, and how we convey that message, you know, whatever we need to do that.
Right. That's awesome. The big thing that I took away at the end here, and hopefully the cameras are still rolling and they're not overheating, but I looked up what the word opus means. Do you know what it means?
Work.
It means
opera. It's where the word opera comes from.
A work. And then I did my own little definition of worship because I looked up worship and then I looked up honor, and it led me down this trail, and I kind of put them all together. And a work derived from the reverence for God. Okay. So ultimately, Mr. Hollands Opus, the composing and directing that he did, was seen in the lives of those he touched.
Yeah, at the end.
It was not merely a music performance.
As the governor at the end says,
right.
This is your symphony.
This is your symphony, right. And this is kind of what I wrote. So the composing and directing of young lives, so this is like Mr. Holland's Opus, was the composing and directing of young lives towards a love for music and the ability to live out their dreams. Mm-hmm. And then I wrote the Christian version of that and how it should read. And I wrote the composing and directing of others by way of discipleship toward the truth of the gospel in everyday life. So wake up each morning and embrace the joy that your job and personal ministry is worship.
We're all called.
We're all called.
And the true test of a leader is not my ability, but the ability of those that I'm teaching.
Right. And that in and of itself is worship because you're doing it because you want to be obedient to God.
Yeah, we get into this trap of, well, some are called into full-time ministry.
Yeah.
I've always been...
Being an accountant is an act of worship.
And that's a calling.
Because you're doing it in reverence for God. You should do everything you can to be good at your job so that you honor God in what you do.
Yeah.
So even the most mundane, not that accountants are boring or anything like that, but I don't care if you're a garbage collector. Mm-hmm. Do it with joy because your job is an act of worship.
And that's where you find your purpose is, living, encouraging people in that walk. And every person can do that.
Yeah, because your job is just what you do. And your purpose is to go and make disciples.
Yeah, we have different vocations, but we all have the same purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good stuff, man. This was a great movie. I loved it.
Good.
I had a blast watching it. I watched it this morning. You have anything else you want to say or...
Well, I guess what I'm just most encouraged by is just the journey.
Yeah.
We're not who we were yesterday. We're not who we're going to be tomorrow. Mm-hmm. God has not, he who has begun a good work in us will be faithful to complete it. Don't wait to be ready to start working.
Right.
Just start.
Right.
And then God's mercies are everlasting. They're new every morning. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to step on some toes. You're going to things are going to get out of balance. But then every day, just waking up and saying, okay, Lord, use me.
Yep.
My life is yours. Offer your bodies as Romans 12, my favorite chapter, says, as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. Mm-hmm. That's your true spiritual act of worship. Mm-hmm. And if we can all do that, then I believe that he will guide us and direct us and put the right people in our path, guide our conversations. Right. We don't have to be perfect or eloquent.
Right.
We just have to be faithful.
Right. And you should have a hunger for the Lord. You should have a hunger to get to know him, a hunger to know the revelation that he gave us in scripture. And you should want to be obedient. That's the difference. So that's the difference between the dichotomy between William H. Macy's character and what Mr. Holland started to realize is more of like, I want to do this as opposed to I have to do this. Like the Pharisees was like law, 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 law. But the good news of the gospel is when your desire changes and you become that, exchange heart for stone. When he does that in you and he does that good work in you, it's a desire to be a slave to righteousness. It's not like, well, mom and dad told me to do this and I'm just doing this to avoid punishment. Mm-hmm. No, I actually desire the things that God desires. As I am continually being sanctified, I am continually wanting my will to be overcome by God's will. And I want to continue moving in that direction.
And while we're still breathing, it's never too late. Because if you noticed, Principal Walters was in the last scene. And there's if you got to catch it, you got to pay attention, but you could tell he finally gets it.
Right.
When he's watching all this happen, even his heart is softened.
Yeah, right.
By watching the legacy that's happened.
Right.
So
that's good stuff, man. Cool. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the WatchWell Podcast on Mr. Hollands Opus. Sorry, we got 3 cameras today and I'm kind of looking at all of them at the same time. Go ahead, do the social media thing, like, subscribe, share. Subscribe on YouTube. Let's see. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We actually have Twitter now. And come back. Let's see. I don't remember when this is going to be released, but if you're hearing this, come back next week. These episodes are released on the first and third Friday of each month, and we'll see you then. Hey guys, it's Parker from the WatchWell Podcast. If you liked this video, we want to go ahead and have you subscribe right here on this button. If you want to watch the full podcast episode, go ahead and click right here. And if you want to watch another WatchWell clip, go ahead and click right here. And remember, if you're going to watch well. We'll see you in the next one.